and welcome back to Education in Focus. Today is a special episode where we're joined by Alex. Hi, Alex.
Hi, Leigh. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you?
Yes, good.
Good. So Alex is joining us today to talk about special educational needs and disabilities. Do you want to tell us a little bit about you, Alex?
Yeah, I worked for Adoption Focus since April as the linking and matching officer, so supporting families post-panel once they're approved. So it's a really exciting role. I get to work with social workers. But in my previous career, I worked as a teacher for 15 years and a SENCO and assistant head. And that was my main sort of specialism, really, within my role as a teacher, that I enjoyed working with children who were starting from a point of disadvantage, which probably is what led me into working in adoption.
That's brilliant, Alex. Thank you so much. So today's episode is, as we said, focusing on special educational needs and disabilities and how you as parents can help schools to support your children. And just in case you're wondering where they are, don't worry, Lisa and Jason are here and raring to go. Hi both.
Hi everyone.
You're right.
So before we start, I guess, can we just clarify special educational needs and disabilities? I know it's referred to as SEND as well. What does that mean?
So SEND stands for Special Educational Needs and Disabilities. So in terms of what SEND is, it's set out quite clearly in the Code of Practice, which is a document that was written in 2014. It's probably due to be updated soon, I imagine. But the important part of it states that a child of compulsory school age has a learning difficulty or disability if he or she has a significantly greater difficulty in learning than the majority of others of the same age, so their peers, has a disability which prevents or hinders the child from making use of facilities of a kind generally provided for others of the same age in mainstream schools or mainstream institutions. Every school will have their own sort of criteria as to who goes onto the SEND register. Sort of standardised. It's up to the individual schools to set that criteria.
I was going to say that seems quite broad when it's just significantly greater difficulty. Surely that's a subjective judgment. So is there variation between schools?
There is, yeah. And schools, I mean, I know Jason's got experience of managing the SEN register. And in the schools that I've worked in, I've worked at 3 different schools as SENCO, and I've found that each one has their own criteria when I've started, and the difficulty is sort of getting everybody in school on board to know what quantifies going on the SEN register.
It's a real dilemma, I think there's no, like you say, there's no one answer that people like desperately want. I suppose it's like, tell us what it is, because you think of some schools, again, I've worked in, where a child may be considered to have additional needs and be on the SEND register, but in another school, that child wouldn't be exceptional because there's maybe a huge number of children in that school. Majority of them might be experiencing difficulties of some kind, but you couldn't possibly put majority of the children on the SEND register in that situation. It wouldn't be feasible. You couldn't have individual plans for every single one in a mainstream school. So it really is variable.
I'm hearing that. Sorry, Alex. No, I was just going to say I'm hearing that for a secondary school teacher, that links quite clearly into choosing the right school, doesn't it? If different schools have different thresholds for what will and will not go on the SEND register, if you're thinking of choosing a secondary school for your child, that might be something that you want to discuss with staff beforehand.
I would agree with that. And I think it's really important when researching secondary schools, if your child has got an identified special need, to do as much research as possible about the school and their approach to SEN. I mean, all schools on their websites should have a send information report, also known as an SIR. And this has to be published on the school's website. It should identify a clear approach to responding to SEN. It should talk about early identification of need and how we make effective in provision to improve long-term outcomes for children. So I think the difficulty is that it isn't standardised. There is advice from the Code of Practice that many schools adopt. However, I think it will vary. It's very difficult for it not to vary from school to school.
Yeah, it often comes down to, I'm looking back at that definition, significantly greater difficulty in learning than the majority of others. So of course, the same, and of course that's going to be dependent in that setting. Compared to in that setting is probably where children may seem to be sticking out, let's say, or
True.
looking
Yeah.
like they're not making the progress.
So this would be, I suppose, quantified by age-related expectations. So it would all be about whether that child is working below age-related expectations, and if they are, what are the reasons for that? With our adopted children, looked after children, we know that there will be developmental gaps, perhaps. We know that if a child is learning English as an additional language, there will perhaps be a delay, not because of ability, but because of language acquisition. There might be all sorts of reasons, personal reasons, social and emotional reasons why children are not making progress. And really it's up to parents and schools to come together to work out why that child isn't making progress in line with age-related expectations, and whether it is a special educational need or whether it is just that child needs some temporary support or additional temporary support to catch up.
I think that's a really important distinction that you just made there, that it's not about a child's capabilities. We're not saying that children who are on the SEND register have like limited capacity for learning. It's that they have a learning difficulty. So that could be that they, like you say, there might be gaps or delays for certain emotional, social, behavioural reasons, or it could be that they learn differently as well. And part of it, I guess, is learning about how that child learns in order to help them. But I'm probably jumping the gun here to later conversations, but I just thought it was really important. It's not about a child's capabilities. It's about progress and how they are learning.
Yeah.
I agree. And one of the aims, actually, I suppose, really, is that you want your child off the SEND register. The school and the parents want, if that's possible, because if it's something that can be addressed, the child can make enough progress to close any gaps or close gaps significantly, then they can come off. So, yeah, it's not like it should be considered once they're on the register, that's it.
I always, I agree to some extent, Jason. I think what's difficult is when a child has a diagnosis, a specific diagnosis. I usually find that it's appropriate, even if it's not affecting that child's learning at a particular time. I think it's really important that that child remains on the SEN register, so that teachers, staff, the SENCO, everybody's aware that at any one time this child's needs may affect their learning.
Yeah, there will be some situations where they'll have a lifelong kind could affect them. And like I say, sometimes schools done such a good job of working out how to support that child that their needs don't present so strongly. But we know that perhaps in a different class, different setting, they move school, then suddenly they become much more apparent.
And that's particularly important. I know your last podcast was about transitions, but when children are transitioning from year 6 to year 7, it's really, really important that the school SENCO and the child's parents have discussions with the SENCO at the new high school or secondary school, and that the needs are made really clear. And, it's made really clear that these are the strategies that have worked, these are the strategies that we've tried, and these are the suggestions that we could make for reasonable adjustments for this child. Yeah. I think that's a really significant transition.
So would you say majority of identification starts with the school picking something up and letting parents know?
I think parents often know first. I think parents have, depending upon the need, I think parents often have a feeling that there might be something that a child's not managing at school. Now, early identification, I mentioned that before, it's really important. And I think sometimes if there is a need that's noticeable to school in the early years, that might come as a bit of a shock to some parents, especially when their children are in nursery, in foundation stage. And it's very difficult because that behaviour might be age appropriate. It might be that the school can see it because it is different from the child's peers. So I think it comes from both places. Often obviously parents know their child best, but the school may see things that when the child is in the setting are more apparent. But I think, a lot of the time as a parent, if you have a concern about your child, and it's very difficult to talk specifically because, as you know, SEND is so broad that it's very difficult to be specific, talk specifically about needs because there are such a range of needs. But if you're a parent and you feel that you have a concern, the best thing you can do is speak to the person in school who knows your child best, and that is usually the class teacher. It's important to have a good relationship with class teachers anyway, sort of a give and take relationship where you can speak to them and they can speak to you quite openly. And I think if you've got that relationship already, where you're regularly asking how your child is, how they're progressing, it's quite easy to contact class teacher on the door or ask for a meeting to discuss any concerns you may have. And at that point, the teacher may say, yes, we've noticed this in school. Yes, this is something that I'm concerned about. Or they may say, that's not something I've noticed, but now you've pointed it out, I can keep an eye out for this sort of thing. I mean, if your concern is to do with cognition and learning, so your child's actual learning and development, you can ask whether your child is making progress in line with their peers, what we talked about, age-related expectations. If your concern is about communication and interaction, what have you noticed at home? Are there certain speech sounds that your child can't make? Are there certain things that they struggle with communicating? Are they having regular dysregulated meltdowns where it's very difficult to bring them back on track? Does the class teacher share your concerns? And if so, what you need to collaborate, you need to come together, to work together as the advocates for that child, to come up with a plan of what might be needed. And we talk about this in the context of a graduated approach. So first by meeting with the teacher and discussing what's in place for what we call quality first teaching. Lisa, I don't know whether that's talked about as much in secondary.
I'll be very frank and say that actually, as a secondary school teacher, I felt quite detached from the SENCO and from the whole team surrounding the SENCO. Obviously, each teacher is aware of the children who were on the register, and they had a breakdown of kind of perhaps how you can make reasonable adjustments in class. But actually, all the underlying process was very, very separate from the individual class teachers. And a lot of those class teachers double up as form tutors as well. So just going back to your previous point about, perhaps approaching a class teacher first, I think in some instances, their first response might be, okay, I note your concerns. I'm going to have to go and speak to someone else about this because I'm not quite sure what the next steps are. And so I feel I'm learning quite a lot here because as I was on the one end of it, I was in the classroom with children trying to support them as best I could, but had no idea really of kind of what went on behind the scenes. So it probably is talked about in secondary schools, but I wasn't really aware of it.
I mean, in terms of quality first teaching, what we're talking about is really good. What it says, what it means. Yeah. We are looking for teachers who are adapting simple things such as providing word banks, providing a task board for a child, providing larger text if that child has got a visual impairment, printing out slides if a child has a processing issue so they don't have to keep looking up and down from the board, and providing an ergonomic pencil if they have a difficulty with fine motor skills, scaffolding for that child, so saying this is what I expect, 3 lines of this, using timers to give the child short, sharp bursts with regular breaks in between. And these different strategies are all things that are just good teaching for everybody, not just for children with SEN.
I was going to say, I'm so glad that you broke it down into kind of what it looks like in the classroom. Because yes, I can tick those off and say I have experience of either doing those things or seeing them done. I just didn't really know what it was called, so that's good.
No, absolutely. And I think a lot of teachers are doing things without even knowing that that's quality first teaching. So, it might be just something very simple. Like if you know a child that a child struggles to focus, then you can bring them in by using their name, or you go to them after you've talked to the whole class, you've introduced the lesson, you've introduced the task. You go over to that particular child and just make sure that they've got a good understanding of what's going on. Just simple things like that. And it's all about knowing the children in your class. It's all about understanding their needs. And certainly you can learn more about that in consultation with parents. I learn absolutely loads from parents. And I think there's almost a perception that sometimes teachers don't listen to parents and don't want to be bothered by parents. But I can always remember a parent saying to me, the reading book that's coming home, it's just not challenging enough for him. And feeling almost immediately like, well, perhaps I should feel defensive about this. I've set this piece of reading for this child, and I've heard them read at school. But actually, who knows that child best if that parent is listening to their child read at home? And I think it's so important to listen to parents, particularly with SEN. It's got to be a collaborative relationship where between the parent, the child, and the school.
That's actually sort of laid out in this code of practice as well, isn't it? I think that kind of approach is what's expected, because that's what works.
And everybody feels informed then. You're all stakeholders in that child's development. And knowledge is power, isn't it? So if you keep parents informed, they're going to feel like they are getting the information they need to support their child.
It's those little conversations, isn't it, sometimes that make a big difference. A parent might say, if they get very anxious if they're sat with the back of the door, they worry about what's behind. They can't just find it really anxious. They won't be able to concentrate, won't be able to focus. As a teacher, wouldn't necessarily think that. I think I remember one thing that made clear. I think happens more of an internal thing, but which is basically that putting children onto the SEND register can't be like a substitute for poor teaching. So quality first teaching is the thing you nailed on, which is really, really important, because that is one of the best ways of supporting the majority of children with SEND anyway. So putting them onto a plan with targets,
absolutely,
that's great. That's absolutely appropriate in most cases.
And it's not the first step in that graduated approach. The graduated approach is right. If we really focus on what this child needs in terms of quality first teaching, and when you have that initial conversation with class teacher or whoever else in the school that you're speaking to about your concerns, you agree what will be put in place, and a time scale should be agreed to review that progress. So it should be then, it might say, let's look at this in 3 weeks' time and see how they're getting on. Let's maybe at that 3-week point make some adaptations and see what else the child needs. And once maybe 6 weeks, so some schools might do half a term, another school might do a term, it just all depends on their SEND policy, then it will be time to review it. And if progress has been made using quality first teaching, then there's absolutely, as you say, Jason, there's absolutely no need for that child to have, or there may not be a need for that child to have an individual plan and be on the SEN register. All they needed was a boost. All they needed was those very small adaptations that can be provided through quality first teaching. But sometimes the child doesn't make progress. And, that's when parents come back and say, what now? What happens now? And when it gets into kind of the real involvement, this is when the SENCO becomes involved. So the SENCO is the Special Educational Needs and Disabilities Coordinator. And that was my role in schools. And like you say, every teacher is a teacher of SEN. That's the line from the Code of Practice. But every teacher is a teacher of SEN. The SENCO is the person who oversees that. But at the point where the child isn't making progress, the class teacher should absolutely arrange a meeting with the SENCO and the parent to discuss what can be done next. And certainly when I was a SENCO, my first step would be, right, I'm going to look at the child's books. I'd like to come and do an observation of the child and feedback to the class teacher, feedback to the parent, and everybody should agree on that as next steps. Everybody should agree that that's in the child's best interest. And then depending upon the area of need that's identified, there might be interventions that your child can access, evidence-based interventions. It might be that if they're having fine motor difficulties, that they are doing some sort of I don't know whether anybody's used disco in school. And children love that. It's a Play-Doh disco. Playing with Play-Doh to music, which all children love.
Funnily enough, in secondary school, I didn't see too much of that, I've got to be honest.
Or for gross motor skills, there's an intervention called BEAM that is favoured amongst lots of school. If a child has sensory needs, there's a real push at the moment for a lot of research suggests that sensory circuits help. So this is where children participate in a range of sensory activities that are alerting and calming. Might be that Lego therapy might help if children are struggling with relationships and have got social and emotional difficulties. If it's learning, it might be that that child would benefit from some pre-tutoring or post-tutoring. There's lots of different things that can be put into place. And then there would be another period of time where that intervention is put into place, that intervention or interventions are put into place. And then that would be reviewed again. And if the child still isn't making progress, then at that point, it would probably be appropriate for the child to be referred to an external specialist, a professional that works in partnership with the school. So that would be perhaps the communication and autism team. It might be the ADHD nurse. It might be pupil and school support, speech and language therapist.
Yeah.
And it can take time for referrals to take place. And there's often waiting lists. But they will come and visit your child and they'll observe them and make recommendations for support. And this, I don't know whether you felt the same, Jason, but at this point, that's when I would add a child to the SEN register. If they were getting external support that could not be accommodated in school, just through school support, through quality first teaching, through school interventions, at that point, if we're needing support from an outside professional, to me, that's SEND.
Yeah, once they need an individual plan, because their needs can't be met just within those reasonable adjustments that you talked about, then yeah, definitely. I think sometimes some schools, and I remember one I worked at, they also kept a register of those children who were on some kind of concern.
Yes.
Just because we wanted to make sure they didn't sort of drop off the end or fall through the cracks, as it were. So check that actually the strategies we're suggesting, are they still working? Do they still need to be there? So when in meetings with the teacher, once a term, say, well, these are the children we flagged up last time. Are you still concerned about them? Do we need to progress it further to something that's more like the SED register with as a plan, or do they need to come off it now because you can't just leave?
I think if a child is having anything that's additional or different to, that takes them away from the classroom or means that they have to have additional support in the classroom beyond quality first teaching, then that's when they need to have an individual plan that's reviewed at least once a term. Often schools will do that every half term.
I find that really interesting because, again, just thinking from my perspective as a secondary school teacher, I didn't realise that for many schools, having like external support would be what put you onto the register or put a child onto the register. As a classroom teacher, because bearing in mind secondary school children can have 13 teachers in a week, so it's a lot of people. What I would see my end would be must have things printed out on green paper in size 14 font, or must have access to this type of pencil, or requires scaffolding, or needs 25% extra time, or that kind of information which I could kind of deliver in class. And then sometimes, like at a parents' evening, I think parents would assume that I had access to more information than that. But actually respecting confidentiality within schools, it isn't the case that the SENCO would go to 13 different teachers and say, this is a child's specific difficulties, this is the support that's being accessed. If it applies to the lesson that you're teaching and it requires you to make certain adjustments, then you do know. But beyond that, you don't have a lot of information automatically. So I just find, like I say, I just find it really interesting that that's possibly the distinction of why some children were on the register and I had information about how to support them, and other children were not on the register, but I had similar information about how to support them. There was like another layer happening behind that.
Suppose.
Lisa, I think some of that. Sorry, Jason.
Oh, go ahead, Alex. Go on.
I think some of the things that you mentioned, like, for example, children having a green background and a particular font, it might be that the child needs breaks during. Some of those are possibly recommendations from a report that an external professional, somebody from the ASDC team, somebody from the learning team, or they might come from a dyslexia assessment. So I think it is interesting that you don't see the background, and I also understand that it would be impossible to know all of those children that come through your classroom as a secondary school teacher. So that possibly is the most effective way of doing it, is highlighting the things that they need. But as you say, you don't know much about the background or why. And I suppose that's where there's the benefit in primary schools of knowing the children in your class really well. We would always share any external reports with and it's really important they're shared with parents, shared with class teachers, that everybody understands what this report means for the child and what the recommendations are that have been put in place.
Recommendations can also include things that happen at home in parallel with what's
True.
going on in school.
Very true.
Parents might have to just sort of put in particular practicing certain techniques, for example, or putting in certain adjustments in the way they set the routines up at home, that kind of thing. So yeah, and it's partly one of the reasons you use these externals. It's not because they necessarily come in and work with your child one-to-one. It's much more to do with giving that expert advice to the staff when we feel slightly not sure about this.
And I think on some occasions what I've used external professionals for is to have them come in and work one-to-one with a teaching assistant or a class teacher to upskill them in their approach. I think that's really useful. Because as teachers, I always found as a teacher I was expected to know an awful lot about every special need. And even as a SENCO, I didn't have an in-depth knowledge of all of the whole range of special needs. And sometimes a child would come into school and they'd have a special need or disability that I wasn't aware of, and I'd have to go away and research it or speak to colleagues. Not everything is simple, not everything is easily diagnosed, and children can often have concurrent conditions or multiple diagnoses.
Yes.
Particularly with ADHD and autism is the one that I'm thinking of. I think sensory processing disorder. I mean, there's a lot of confusion with attachment and autism as well, and we often talk about that in family finding. So if a very young child is presenting with autistic traits at maybe age 2 or 3, 4, it can often be to do with insecure attachments or gaps in their development. So there's a lot of sort of grey areas in SEND, and because of the fact that there is so many different types of need, because of the fact that within each need there is a huge spectrum, it is very difficult sometimes to get to the bottom of it, and it sometimes takes schools a long time to find out what the barrier is for that child.
I also want to add in there that sometimes children are very good at covering up what they find difficult. And I'm thinking specifically of a young man that I worked with. He was 18, he was sitting his A-levels. We hadn't taught him at my school. He'd come to us specifically for A-levels, but he'd previously failed his maths A-level. And no one could understand why, because he was very bright, very able, did really well in class. The homework was excellent. He worked well. He was always the first with the answers. He was fantastic. And it took me a whole year of teaching him to realise that he was transposing his numbers the wrong way around. So if he had
Right.
to copy numbers, and in A-level maths, you have to write line after line after line of working, changing one thing each time. And he was transposing digits, but that never came up in classwork because he'd just be like, oh, I've just written it around the wrong way. Oh, made a silly mistake, but I know what I'm doing. Didn't come up in homework because he'd checked and rechecked. It was only in exam situations it came up. But he went away, and actually, I don't know what the diagnosis was, but it was a diagnosable thing that he had difficulties with. And it'd take him up until the age of 18 for this to be picked up. Countless professional staff. And that was partly because of how well he had masked that specific learning difficulty. And that's not to make it sound like I'm blaming him. It was a coping mechanism, coping
Yeah.
strategy that he developed. But it was just really interesting that actually, in some instances, when the need is very specific or the difficulty is very specific, children might have developed coping strategies to get around it or to mask it from those around them. So yeah, just while I was talking about, just while we talk about the difficulties of identification, I think children learn in some instances to manage with what they find difficult,
Yeah,
and that
we
can
know
hide
that's
it
true
for
in
longer.
masking, don't we, for children with the autistic
Absolutely.
background?
And we
And actually,
see.
oh, no, go on. Sorry, it's just so keen to say. No, I was just thinking, talking about that coping. Some children also develop other ways of masking and coping, which is by perhaps, displaying inappropriate behaviors because that's the way they avoid. It's an avoidance strategy. So sometimes that the reason for that is sometimes because they've got a difficulty with that learning and they're trying to avoid it. So then they might be identified as having a behavioural difficulty
Yeah.
where it
A
could well
learning
be a learning.
difficulty.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that's very common. Probably, I'd be interested to know what the statistics are there, because I think often there's always a reason, isn't there, for that dysregulated behaviour in schools. There's always something underneath it. It's not just, we don't have naughty children. We have children who become dysregulated when they're overwhelmed. We have children who become upset if they feel out of control of a situation. And that's when we see disruptive behaviour or challenging behaviour. And it's up to us as professionals to try to get to the bottom of that. I think what we've said before about working with parents is absolutely vital. And I know I had a child in year 5 and she was a model pupil at school. She had some difficulties with her learning, but overall, beautifully behaved child at school, very eager to please staff, very seemingly happy in her relationships. But when she got home, it would be, and it's the analogy of having like a bottle of fizzy water that you're shaking up all day, but the lid's on. And then when they see the person that they know will love them, whatever happens, their safe person, the person that they've got that secure attachment with, that's when we see the behaviour. And the amount of times I've sat in my office and had parents come in and say, we're seeing some really, really challenging behaviour at home. And the class teacher will say, well, they're nothing like that at school. But when I've gone in to observe, and the class teacher hasn't got the ability to do this because they've got 25, 30, 35 children in their class. But when I've had the opportunity to observe one-to-one, just watching a child in an assembly, for example, you can see very subtle, minor things that they do as coping strategies to help them mask. So they might be continuously tapping on the hand. They might be pulling at their clothing, just subtle things that they're doing to kind of get some sort of sensory feedback. And they do that throughout the school day. My middle son, he always used to come home with the neck of his t-shirt absolutely soaking, and he'd be chewing his t-shirt all day. And that was his way of self-regulating, self-soothing. He was good. Teachers never, ever have an issue with him until then. He went through a phase, it's getting better now, but he went through a phase of coming home, hitting and kicking me. It would all be on me. That would be his release from holding it in. He would be exhausted from holding that in all day.
I recognise that.
So that's why I think it's so important. It is so important that we listen to parents. We hear what they've got to say. We take it seriously. A lot of teachers I've worked with have said, well, we're not seeing any evidence of that in school. that's unimportant. We need to listen.
Yeah.
We need to trust parents.
And that's where you can accidentally say something quite unhelpful as a teacher, because you might just go, oh, okay, well,
Don't say that.
we're lucky, aren't we, or something. Oh,
Yeah.
thank goodness they don't do that here. Well, okay, well, what else is happening? And then there's a temptation to feel like you're not being believed. They're being a bit skeptical about it. Whereas it's not the case, is it? It's like you say, what are the little telltale leakages of stress
Yeah.
that might be going on?
Yeah.
It's fantastic, Alex, that in your role as SENCO, you were able to go in and do those observations and pick those things up. And I just say to anyone listening who's adopted through Adoption Focus, if you are being dismissed by your school, we would hope that you weren't. We would hope that they are listening to you and taking your concerns seriously. But if you are feeling a little dismissed, a little bit unheard, then you can contact us. This week, I'm going to go in and do a school observation. And working in partnership with schools, schools are incredibly supportive of it, but perhaps they don't quite know what they're looking for. So it is something that you can seek more help with if you feel the school perhaps aren't quite on the same page as you.
Absolutely. We've also got, if you haven't got a child who you've adopted through Adoption Focus, each local authority has SENDIAS that you can consult with if you feel you're not being heard, if you feel that you're having challenges being understood by your child's school. You can contact SENDIAS stands for Special Educational Needs and Disability Information, Advice and Support Services. So every local authority should have one of those, and you can find their details simply by Googling them.
Sometimes they have different names for them, unfortunately.
Do they?
Yeah, in different authorities. But nevertheless, if you Google it, I'm sure it'll still direct you to the one the equivalent to it. And they are great because they provide independent advice. They can sit in on meetings with you just to help listen and offer advice, and just to check that what the school's saying to the parent is actually accurate and appropriate. And I was going to ask you a question about what should a parent expect from an SEND support plan? Is that something worth talking about?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably a topic on its own, but briefly, they used to be called IEPs, so individual education plans, and then they were, I don't know why, but they were scrapped, and each school now calls them their own thing. So we've called them ISPs, so individual support plans. I don't know whether you've come across different names for them, Jason, but I mean, I always think ultimately it's a document which states what the child needs for their learning to be equitable in class. So there's a lot of talk, and we can talk about it another time, but we set SMART targets. So the child will have specific targets that are set by the class teacher, sometimes in consultation with the SENCO, and these should be measurable, they should be achievable, they should be timely. These are things that children need to make the next step within the time period. So if it's a 6-week time period, what do you want that child to be able to do within that 6-week period? And what support is school putting into place to make that happen, in addition to quality first teaching? Because if they've got a plan, this is the stage up from quality first, just relying upon quality first teaching. So yeah, it should normally be no more than 3 targets for that child per term. And depending on whether a school reviews half-termly or termly, that will depend on what those targets look like and the breadth of those targets. But those should be reviewed regularly. It should be set with parents and children if they're old enough to contribute. Everything, I mean, as much as possible, the children can be involved in setting those targets because they feel ownership of it. They're involved in it and feel committed to it. They know who's going to be supporting them to achieve those targets. And then if they haven't, when it's time to review, which should be done at least once every term, so 3 times a year, when it's time to review those, everybody should come together to look at what should be done. And if that a target needs to roll over, that's fine, or if it needs to be adapted or changed, or if it's not achievable, it needs to be broken down, taken back a step. But all in consultation with everybody involved in that child's learning.
Yeah, I think we probably could do a whole topic on that. I was just thinking, we could go through examples of what targets are not acceptable, because and it's not always obvious to a parent. They might think, oh, that's fine. You might say something crazy like to get better at writing. Like,
Yeah, and parents do.
you see some crazy things.
And yeah, and I've done, and that's why we talk about
Yeah,
SMART targets. So we talk specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and timely, or time measured.
I thought it was really interesting, though, you said that they should be set in conjunction with class teachers, because, again, reflecting upon being in a secondary school, I certainly know that there were children with maths targets that were not set in conjunction with maths teachers at all. And there was a laugh in my voice when I said that, not because I think it's funny, but I'm actually gobsmacked that really we should have been involved in that process and weren't. And I've also unfortunately seen some of those targets roll on term after term and year after year, which clearly indicates that they weren't appropriate targets
yeah.
in the first place.
It's demoralizing for everybody. I mean, like you
Completely.
say, involving the child is great because if you've got smart targets, genuinely smart targets, then you can actually sit down and go, wow, look at this. You've look at the progress you've made. Look at the
Yeah.
difference. This is what you did last time. Look at what you can do now. Isn't that marvelous? Let's celebrate some success, because for these children, success is not something they're very used to, or they're certainly very conscious or become quite conscious of having needs and difficulties compared to their friends. So this is an opportunity really to celebrate if it's done properly. But I think, yeah, if a teacher's not involved in target setting, if it's just imposed on them by let's say that's just pointless.
And I think I also wanted to mention it so that as parents, people feel empowered to be able to say, hang on, this target wasn't achieved last term. Was it the right target? Do we need to scale it back? Have you spoken to the class teacher? Have you, and because in an ideal world, you'd all be sat together doing that. I know that doesn't always happen. So I think as a parent, you have the right to ask those types of questions to make sure that the targets are correct for your child.
And as a parent, you are your child's advocate, and you have to speak up for them. And you might feel awkward about that, as often we do as parents. We feel like, oh, we don't want to. There's definitely children with a higher level of need in my child's class. I don't want to bother the class teacher. I know teachers are under a lot of pressure. I know that schools are under-resourced. But you have to keep asking for those. If you're not getting the meetings termly, if you're not getting good communication, you have to advocate for your child. And that's not always easy. And you might need the support of an external agency like SENDIS. But certainly you've got to think nobody else is going to do it. You're the one who knows your child best. You're the one who has got a good idea of what they need. And you go into school, and it's not unrealistic to ask for reasonable adjustments to be made for your child to improve their learning. It's all about personalising their learning to suit individual needs. And that's not easy as a teacher, but we have to give it our very best shot.
Yeah. But if they're not doing those things, those basic things, then they're actually not following the code of practice. They're not following their own policies, and they're going to land, they're in danger of getting themselves in a bit of trouble. So
Absolutely. And I think it's important to read the school's send information report. It's important to read the school's SEND policy, which will again be online and available to the public. I often talk to adopters post-panel when they are interested in a child, when they have expressed interest in a child who's got a specific learning need. But I mean, most of our children who we see adopted have got some sort of attachment, SEMH need. And I think it's really important to research the school that you're sending your child to. A lot of schools now are attachment aware schools that have done specific training. The staff have done specific training to get that accreditation as an attachment aware school. And those are the schools that are really investing in children. And I always think if children are happy socially, they've got good attachments in school, their teachers understand them, that's when you see good progress. that's the foundation of education, isn't it? Children being happy and comfortable in school. I mean, it might seem quite extreme to some people, but I've always advocated for the first half term being about forming relationships, less focus on the academic progress and more about forming relationships, getting to know children in your class. And then that following after Christmas, then you've got a really good foundation to build on. But schools panic about that kind of thing about priority.
They do. I had a meeting the other day with a school, actually, that very issue. There's a child suffering some significant separation anxiety, and the school, to be fair, are doing a really good job of trying to adjust things to make it work. And they've tried different things, and they haven't always worked, but this time they've got a solution that just seems to be working. And so I just said, look, they're in school. This child's in school. They seem quite settled. They're getting in. They're not kicking. They're not screaming. They're not dysregulated. Let's just accept that and then enjoy that achievement. Don't worry about the learning at the moment. I know it sounds awful to say it, but they always felt like a relief and said, yeah, we can say that. The teacher said, yeah, too. I know as a teacher, I feel it difficult saying these things, but of course, learning isn't just about academic progress. This child isn't going to learn, so forget it. Let's just focus
I'm
on
glad
that.
you said that you find it hard. I'm glad you said you find it hard, because I've got today's Lisa totally agreeing with you 100%, and then I've got teacher Lisa going, but for every year apart from year 10, 11, 12 and 13, right? Because those are the exam years and those are really important. We can't waste any time. And that is not how I think now, but you might find that there is a strong resistance.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
From some teachers, but explaining why it is right until children are happy and settled, and that they won't actually.
I think small steps of progress are what we have to focus on, and I think an important thing to mention, certainly in primary school, homework is not mandatory, and the amount of parents who do not know this and whose schools will be very cross with them for me saying this. Children spend, I've seen it, you've seen it, Lisa, you've seen it, Jason. Children, there's a lot of back-to-back learning going on in school, and there's a lot of information for children to take in. Most children need to come home and decompress and be with their families and feel secure and safe and have those demands removed. And I mean, I don't know whether anybody remembers trying to educate their own children in lockdown. I mean, it's a completely different ballgame. I'm a teacher. On paper, I've got the skills to educate. My children were of the age that I taught, but it was impossible to engage them because they're not used to having those demands from me. I'm their safe person. I'm where they decompress. I'm that's somebody they talk to, and to get away from that. And I think a lot of parents struggled with the homeschooling because children weren't used to that level of demand being placed on them by their parents. But I think sometimes, and I've suggested it plenty of times for a reasonable adjustment, that homework could be reduced or paused for children who are really struggling socially, emotionally. And that time could be spent playing games with parents, sharing a book, listening to music together, making something together. It doesn't have to be something specific.
That's quite a timely topic of conversation for me at the moment, because we've had my daughter's in year 1, and we've had a ramp up of homework. We've got reading and spelling and maths now each week. But November is actually the month that we do our letterbox to birth family, and she wants to do cards for 4 siblings and 2 birth parents. And this is quite a big thing for her. So actually, we've been doing that instead of homework, and I had to just tell the class teacher she will not be doing any homework for the month of November. I do support you. I do want her to succeed, but actually, we've got other priorities right now. These are more important, and I'm not going to put that pressure on her. So again, going back to advocating, if you feel that you need a temporary break from those extra, be it for adoption related issues or special educational needs, it's absolutely fine to take that break.
Well, not to plug everything here, but we do have a podcast all about homework, don't we? Remember, and in that we make those
we
points
do,
and very clearly. So I hope people haven't heard it, then perhaps want to have a listen to that, because we kind of explain some of those things too, don't we? And the fact that it doesn't have a massive impact anyway on the outcomes.
In summary, if you have a concern about your child that hasn't been raised with you by the class teacher, usually your gut instinct is right. Usually it may be that your class teacher can reassure you, that the class teacher of your child can reassure you, but it also may be that they've got lots of children to monitor, it's the early part of the year, and it's really helpful for a parent to come and have that conversation with them. So read the school's Send Information report, which can be found on their website. The first person to talk to is the class teacher. They're the person who knows your child best and spends the most time with your child. Be persistent. You don't need to be confrontational. You can just be persistent if you need to be. You can always ask to meet with SENCO if you feel that you're not being heard by the class teacher. And you and your child, if appropriate, should always be fully involved in progress reviews, target setting. We haven't even touched on EHCPs today, and I think that's a separate that's an educational healthcare plan, which is the next step up from an individual education plan. But certainly at every stage you should be involved, and your voice should be heard, and your child's voice should be heard if that's appropriate. And I would always keep notes of dates and what's been agreed, because schools are under-resourced, schools are under pressure, and it might be that you need to chase things. It might be that you need to do some of the legwork sometimes. You might just need to keep on at your school saying, has that referral been made to the communication and autism team? Has that referral been made to pupil and school support? Has my child now got a writing slope, which we agreed that would be good for their handwriting? Are they taking part in a social skills group 3 times a week, as we discussed? All of those things are important for you to monitor, and you're not to be afraid as parents to ask those questions and be persistent if you need to be.
Good summary.
Is there anything that you would add?
No, I don't think I would. I think you've summarised it very well.
Alex, thank you so much for giving up your time to share your experience and knowledge with us today. It has been incredibly helpful, and hopefully we can have you on some future podcasts thinking a little bit more in depth about some of those topics you've mentioned. And as ever, Lisa and Jason, it's been a pleasure. For anyone listening, if you think that your child may be experiencing anything discussed today, please don't hesitate to contact us, and we can try and offer you and your family the support that you need. If you've got any questions or you've got suggestions of topics for future podcasts, please don't hesitate to drop us an email, and you can do that at education@adoption-focus.org.uk. And as ever, thank you for listening. Bye.